In the Sheikh's bed, secrets, lies, and a deadly affair. Hook, what if everything you thought you knew was a lie? A woman trapped in a deadly game of deception, running for her life, uncovering secrets darker than she could ever imagine. Will she escape or fall into the web of a ruthless mastermind? Stay with us till the end to discover the shocking truth behind the Sheikh's deadly game. You won't believe what happens next. The room was still, too still. A faint smell of jasmine lingered in the air, mingling with something sharper. The curtains, heavy with the desert dust, hung motionless, casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the light. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, it was unnervingly quiet. Her heartbeat was the only sound. The thick, cool sheets clung to her skin as she shifted. Her eyes flickered open. She wasn't alone. A figure stood by the window, his back to her. She could feel his presence, the weight of his gaze, even though he hadn't turned around. Her body froze. Every muscle tensed. The Sheikh. His silhouette was sharp against the moonlight. The power he exuded was palpable, as if the very air around him was charged with his authority. But tonight, something was different. The energy in the room was off. Tension crackled like electricity. She pushed herself up, her movements slow, careful. Her breath caught in her throat. There was something wrong. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. The Sheikh turned, slowly, deliberately. His eyes locked with hers. But they weren't the eyes she knew. They were dark, hollow, cold. Her heart skipped a beat. A chill swept through her body. "You shouldn't have come here," he murmured, his voice low, menacing. The words sank into her like ice. Her pulse quickened. She glanced around, searching for a way out. The door was locked. Her eyes darted to the window. It was too far. Her gaze returned to him. The Sheikh took a step forward. Each movement was calculated, predatory. She was trapped. He reached for her and she flinched. The touch, unexpectedly gentle, sent a shudder through her. "Don't run," he whispered. "You can't escape." Panic gripped her chest. She tried to push him away, but he was stronger. The faint rustle of fabric, the soft creak of his movements. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. He leaned in closer, his breath warm against her skin. Her mind raced. This wasn't the Sheikh she knew. Who was this man? His hand slid down to her wrist, holding her firmly. She struggled, but his grip tightened. "What do you want?" she gasped. A dark smile spread across his lips. "You've been asking the wrong questions," he said. The truth, he continued, would shatter everything. Her mind spun. What was he hiding? Before she could react, he turned and stepped away, his footsteps echoing in the empty room. She could feel his presence, even as he moved farther from her. The seconds stretched on, unbearable. Then a soft click. The door. It opened. The sound of his departure sent a rush of air into the room. The shock of it almost knocked her to her knees. But she didn't dare move. Not yet. Not until she understood. The truth. The horrible truth. The door clicked shut behind him. The silence returned, suffocating. Her breath was shallow, erratic. She could hear the pulse in her ears, the echo of it deafening. What just happened? The air in the room felt heavier now, like something unseen was pressing down on her. She stood frozen, unable to move. Her fingers trembled as she touched her neck, where his breath had just been. It still felt warm, but something inside her, something deep inside, was already beginning to shift. What was it he had meant? The truth would shatter everything. The words replayed in her mind, like a broken record, looping endlessly. She needed answers, needed to understand what had just occurred. But fear held her still. The moonlight slanted through the curtains, casting long, haunting shadows. Her eyes wandered to the bed, where his scent still lingered. The sheets were askew, evidence of a struggle. No, a dance. she thought bitterly. Her mind fought to piece it all together. Then she noticed it. A small, faintly glowing object on the floor by the bed. Her heart skipped. It was a ring. She bent down, her breath catching in her throat as she reached for it. It felt wrong. Cold. Her fingers wrapped around the cold metal, and she could almost feel the weight of its history. The ring was old, ancient almost. Not something the Sheikh would wear. Her thoughts raced. She examined it under the dim light, the intricate design twisted and almost sinister. And then it hit her. The truth. This wasn't just a game. This wasn't some fleeting affair. This was something far darker. A different world entirely. The ring, the marking, was familiar. She had seen it before. In the court records, in the murder files, the Lori showcase. Her stomach lurched. It couldn't be. But the pieces were all falling into place. The Sheikh wasn't who he claimed to be. He was hiding more than just secrets. He was part of something far more dangerous. And she had walked right into it. The very thing she had been investigating, the case that had haunted her for months, was here. It was in the room with her now. The truth was darker than she ever imagined. She turned the ring over, her eyes wide in horror. There, engraved on the inside, was a name she had read 1,000 times in the files, a name that should have never crossed her path again. It was his, the Sheikh's true name, and it was tied to the murder, to the death of Lori Show. Everything was connected. Her heart pounded. She had to leave. She had to get out of there. But as her hand reached for the door, it clicked. It was locked. The weight of the ring in her palm felt heavier. The truth was closing in, and there was no way out. Her fingers tightened around the ring. Her breath was ragged now. She could feel the walls closing in, suffocating her with their silence. She tried the door again. It didn't budge. Panic surged. There was no way out. Her pulse thrummed in her ears, a constant reminder that time was slipping away. She backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the room for anything she could use. Nothing. Her mind raced. She could feel the Sheikh's presence still lingering, even though he was gone. His words echoed in her mind. You can't escape. But she couldn't just stay here, trapped. The ring felt like a ticking bomb in her hand. She could already see the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The truth was horrifying. The Sheikh was more than just a man of power and wealth. He was part of something far darker, something that had led to the brutal murder of Lori Show. And now she was tangled in it. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape while she still could. But the room felt like a cage, the walls pressing in on her from all sides. She turned back to the bed, her eyes scanning the room once more. Her thoughts raced, jumping from one horrifying possibility to the next. But then she saw it, a small, leather-bound notebook lying innocently on the nightstand. Her breath hitched. She hadn't noticed it before. With shaky hands, she reached for it. The moment her fingers touched it, a cold shiver ran down her spine. This was it, the missing piece. Her mind flashed back to everything she had learned about the Lori showcase. The missing pages from the case files. The whispers of a secret society operating in the shadows. She opened the notebook carefully, her eyes scanning the pages. They were filled with names, dates, places, scrawled hastily, as if whoever had written them feared being discovered. But there, in the midst of the chaos, was a single line that made her blood run cold. A name, her name, and beneath it a note, "You are next." Her breath caught in her throat. The realization hit her like a punch. She had been marked. The truth was worse than she had ever feared. She was tangled in the web of a deadly conspiracy, and now she had no way out. And somewhere in the shadows, the Sheikh was waiting for her next move. Her heart raced as she slammed the notebook shut. There was no more time for hesitation. She had to act. Before it was too late, her fingers trembled as she clutched the notebook to her chest. The words haunted her, echoing in her mind. "You are next." The door. She had to get to the door. Her breath quickened, but her legs felt like lead. She stumbled toward the window instead, her eyes scanning the outside world. It was a long drop. Too long. She was trapped in a cage of stone and glass. Her mind screamed for escape, but the terror of the unknown held her frozen. What was he planning? Why was she chosen? Was it the investigation? The case? Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized something more chilling. She wasn't the first target. Lori's show was just the beginning. The truth was far worse than she had ever imagined. The Sheikh's game was only just beginning. She pressed her ear to the door, straining for any sound. Nothing. Her hands were slick with sweat now. The air felt thick, suffocating. Her eyes flicked back to the room. Her mind spun as she pieced it together. This wasn't just about her. The Sheikh was part of something global, a deadly network that spanned continents. And Lori Show had been its latest victim. Her pulse raced, a flash of movement. She whirled around, but the room was empty. For a moment, she thought her mind had betrayed her, but then she saw it. A shadow in the corner, barely noticeable at first. She froze. The figure moved slowly, deliberately. It was him, the Sheikh. Her breath caught. He had returned. His presence was suffocating, like a weight pressing on her chest. He stood there, silent, watching her. She backed away, but there was nowhere to go. "You shouldn't have come here," he had said. She realized now how true that was. The truth behind Lori's death, behind everything, was slipping out of her grasp, and she was drowning in it. His eyes never left hers. There was no escape. The darkness closed in, and in that moment she understood. She wasn't just a pawn in his game. She was the final piece, the last one. The truth, she realized, wasn't just about exposing the Sheikh. It was about becoming part of his world. She was already entangled, her fate sealed. And now, it was only a matter of time before he decided how the game would end. Her body was rigid, but inside, something broke. Her world, already crumbling, fell apart completely. The Sheikh took a step forward, the air crackling with tension. His hand reached out. She didn't move. She couldn't. It was over. And there was no escape. His fingers grazed her skin, sending a jolt of ice through her veins. She flinched, but couldn't pull away. The weight of his touch felt like a warning, a final act in a play she hadn't agreed to. "You're mine now," he whispered, his voice like velvet and steel. The words chilled her to the bone. He was right. In that moment, she realized how much she had already lost. Her life, her choices were no longer her own. The Sheikh had claimed her, just as he had claimed Lori Show. She closed her eyes for a brief second, but it didn't help. The darkness was all around her now. The air felt heavier, suffocating. Her fingers clutched the notebook tightly, the pages pressing against her chest. A small lifeline in the overwhelming silence. But even that lifeline was slipping through her fingers. She opened her eyes again, finding him still standing there, studying her like a predator preparing to strike. The space between them had closed to nothing. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. The terror of the unknown, the danger she had walked into, surged up in her throat, choking her. His lips parted, but before he could speak, a loud bang echoed from somewhere outside the room. Her heart leapt in her chest, but the Sheikh didn't flinch. His expression remained unreadable, cold. The sound came again, louder this time. A series of thuds, followed by muffled voices. Her pulse surged. Someone was coming. The Sheikh turned toward the door. His eyes narrowed as if he had expected this. For the first time, she saw a flicker of unease in his otherwise composed demeanor. But the moment passed, his face settling back into that same impassive mask. "You don't have much time," he said, his voice low. "But neither do they." Before she could respond, he turned and moved toward the shadows. With a final glance over his shoulder, he spoke one last chilling word. "Run." And then he was gone. She stood there, frozen in disbelief, for a heartbeat. Run. Her body reacted before her mind caught up. She bolted to the window, yanking at the curtains. She had no idea how long she had, but every instinct screamed at her to move, to get out, before it was too late. The door behind her rattled. Someone was trying to force it open. Her hand reached for the latch, but before she could twist it, the door burst open. A figure stepped into the room. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the Sheikh. It wasn't anyone she recognized, but he was here, and he was armed. The pistol gleamed in the low light as the man raised it toward her. "Don't move," he ordered, his voice rough, like a man who had seen too much. Her mind raced, but all she could think about was the way his finger was hovering over the trigger. There was no time to think, no time for anything but the instinct to survive. And with one final glance toward the window, the only escape, she made a choice. She turned, charging toward the door, using every ounce of strength to break free. As the man shouted behind her, she reached for the handle. Her fingers were slick with sweat, the seconds stretching like an eternity. And then the world went black, the darkness engulfed her, swallowing the world around her. For a split second, she couldn't tell if she was still standing or if the floor had given way beneath her. Her mind spun, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. The faint scent of jasmine and something metallic filled the air. Her legs buckled, and she crumpled to the floor. But she didn't lose consciousness. Not yet. Her vision swam, everything fuzzy, as though she was submerged underwater, trying to reach the surface. She could feel the coldness of the stone beneath her hands, the rough texture scraping against her palms. But she couldn't focus on that. Her mind struggled to make sense of what had just happened. The man with the gun, had he shot her? No, she wasn't bleeding. She felt dizzy, disoriented, but not injured. Her thoughts were like fragments of shattered glass, each one a shard of truth she couldn't quite piece together. Her body felt heavy, weighed down by something unseen. But she forced herself to push through the haze. She needed to move. With trembling hands, she pushed herself up, leaning against the wall for support. Every part of her screamed to stay down, to give up. But the fear of what was waiting for her, if she did, kept her going. The door was ajar. Through the crack, she could hear voices now louder, more frantic. She didn't have much time. Her fingers brushed the wall as she stood, her vision slowly clearing. Every muscle screamed, her body protesting, but she pressed forward. A noise came from the hallway, footsteps, approaching fast. Her heart raced. She had to act now. She darted toward the window. The night air hit her face, sharp and cold. She could hear the wind howling outside, the world beyond the stone walls dark and distant. Her hand trembled as she reached for the latch, her fingers clumsy, uncooperative. The footsteps grew closer. She jerked the window open with one final, desperate push. The sound of the room behind her seemed to grow louder, the voices and footsteps blending together into a cacophony. She climbed out, her legs unsteady, but she was out. The drop was still too far to be safe, but she had no choice. The alternative was far worse. With a shaky breath, she pulled herself up onto the ledge, her heart racing as the ground below seemed miles away. She didn't look down. She couldn't. She just jumped. The world blurred around her, the wind rushing in her ears. Her body hit the ground hard. Pain erupted through her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She pushed herself up, forcing her body to keep moving, ignoring the ache in her limbs, the burn in her chest. The darkness outside was her only ally now, and the footsteps, the voices, they were still chasing her. But this time, she was running on pure instinct. She was free, but not safe. Not yet. She ran into the night, hoping that the truth, whatever it was, would be enough to keep her alive. But deep down, she knew. The worst was still ahead. Her breath came in jagged gasps as she pushed her body harder, the darkness of the desert night swallowing her whole. The cold air stung her face, sharp and biting, but it wasn't enough to freeze the panic coursing through her veins. Her feet hit the ground in uneven strides, every step carrying her farther from the place she had just escaped. But the noise, the footsteps, they were getting closer. Closer. Her eyes flicked over her shoulder, but she couldn't see anyone. The shadows were thick here, but she could feel them. Feel the presence, the pursuit closing in. She kept running. The wind whistled in her ears, and the harsh sand scraped against her skin as she ran farther into the wasteland. Her mind buzzed with fragments, clutching the notebook, the ring, the chilling words of the Sheikh. "You're mine now. You are next." What had she walked into? Was she going to end up like Laurie Shaw, another name swallowed by the darkness? No, she couldn't let that happen. The thought was a knife in her chest, a constant reminder to keep moving, to keep fighting. The weight of the notebook in her pocket felt like a brand on her side, its secrets a dangerous burden. But what did it all mean? She had no answers, only more questions, and those questions were her only guide through the vast, empty desert stretching out before her. Her legs were heavy now, each step like dragging a weight behind her. She stumbled, but forced herself back up. She couldn't afford to fall. Not now. The crunch of sand beneath her feet was the only sound in the air, the silence of the night pressing in around her. Then another sound, a car engine, faint but unmistakable. Her heart lurched. They were coming. They weren't far behind. She spotted a line of trees in the distance, barely visible in the moonlight, their silhouettes stretching like fingers reaching into the night. An escape, maybe. She focused on the trees, her legs moving faster, the pain in her body an afterthought. Her vision blurred, but she kept running, pulling her body forward, not daring to stop. She made it to the tree line, the thick trunks offering a brief respite, but only for a moment. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the desert. Her breath caught in her throat. It was them. They had found her. She glanced around frantically, but there was nowhere to hide, nothing to shield her from the headlights that were closing in fast. The engine roared louder. She turned and bolted again, weaving through the trees as the sound of the car drew closer. She was close. She could hear the tires, hear the screech of them in the sand. But it wasn't enough. The air was too thin, her body too exhausted, and the fear, that gnawing, suffocating fear, threatened to crush her. Then, out of nowhere, the ground beneath her gave way. A sharp pain shot through her ankle as she twisted it on a rock, falling to the ground with a grunt. She gasped, trying to push herself up, but the pain was too much. Her vision spun, and then she heard it, a voice, low, cold. "Gotcha." Before she could react, a hand grabbed her shoulder, jerking her back. She didn't fight it. She couldn't. Her head was spinning. And then, in the next heartbeat, everything went black. The world around her was a blur of darkness and confusion. Her body felt numb, like she was floating, untethered from reality. The grip on her shoulder tightened, pulling her upright. She couldn't focus on the face in front of her. Everything was too far away. Her body was heavy, her limbs uncooperative. The sharp pain in her ankle was a distant echo in her mind. She blinked, forcing her vision to clear. The dim light of a nearby car illuminated the figure before her, tall, imposing, with an air of authority that sent a chill down her spine. It was him, the man from the room, the one with the gun. But this time, there was no hesitation in his movements. His hands were firm, unyielding, as he pulled her along. "You should have stayed out of it," he said, his voice low, almost sympathetic. But there was no kindness in his eyes. She wanted to speak, to scream, but her throat was dry, her mouth a desert. Her breath came in shallow gasps as he shoved her into the back seat of the car, the door slamming shut behind her. The car started moving almost immediately, the engine roaring to life. The road was unfamiliar, dark, desolate, stretching out before them like a never-ending expanse of nothing. She barely registered the movement of the car, her mind still trapped in a haze of confusion and fear. She wanted to fight, to escape, but she was too weak. Her head lolled against the window, the cold glass biting into her skin as she tried to focus on anything that could help her make sense of this nightmare. But nothing made sense. Her pulse pounded in her temples. The man next to her was silent, his eyes trained on the road, unwavering. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Where were they taking her? What did they want from her? And what was the Sheikh's true game? The pieces were slipping further from her grasp, the truth just out of reach. Her thoughts were interrupted when the man turned toward her, his gaze colder now. "You're not meant to know this much," he said, almost as if to himself. The words chilled her to the bone. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "What's the Sheikh hiding?" she managed to croak, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You should have stayed in the dark," he said. "Now you've seen too much." She felt a wave of dread wash over her, a sense of finality in his words. There was no going back now. The car slowed, turning off the main road and onto a dirt path. The landscape outside the window shifted, a few scattered trees, a distant mountain range. And then, in the distance, a structure appeared, looming against the horizon. It was a compound, fortified, isolated. Her stomach dropped. The car came to a stop in front of a large gate, and she was pulled out of the vehicle, her legs barely able to support her. Two more men emerged from the shadows, their expressions unreadable. The man who had been driving gestured toward the compound. "You're going inside, whether you want to or not." She didn't speak. Her throat was dry, and every part of her screamed to resist, to escape. But there was nowhere to go. They dragged her toward the compound, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the night. And as they pushed open the massive iron doors, a sense of finality settled over her. This was it. She had crossed a line she couldn't undo. And now, she was about to discover just how deep the darkness went. The compound loomed before her, a fortress of stone and steel, its gates creaking open like the mouth of some dark beast ready to swallow her whole. She felt the cold air press against her skin, sharp and unforgiving. Every step felt like she was walking deeper into a nightmare. Her ankles still throbbed, but she couldn't focus on the pain. The men flanking her didn't speak, but their presence was suffocating. They pushed her forward, their hands firm but not rough, almost clinical like they had done this many times before. The doors shut behind her with a metallic clang, sealing her fate. Inside the compound, the walls were high, the halls dimly lit, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and move on their own. The air was thick with the scent of old stone, metal, and something she couldn't place. Something wrong. Her heartbeat quickened, the sound of it loud in her ears. They led her down a narrow corridor, the silence only broken by the soft shuffle of her feet and the occasional creak of the floorboards. At the end of the hall, a door loomed larger, more imposing than any of the others. Without a word, one of the men unlocked it, pushing her inside. She stumbled into a large, dimly lit room, her eyes darting around, trying to take in her surroundings. The space was sparse, but there was something chilling about it. A large desk sat in the center, papers scattered across it, and in the far corner, a row of tall shelves stacked with books she didn't recognize. But it wasn't the room that caught her attention. It was the man sitting behind the desk. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face partially obscured by the shadows. The moment she saw him, her stomach clenched. It was the Sheikh. But this man was different. He wasn't the same one she had met earlier, the charming, composed man who had woven his web of lies. This was something else. Cold, calculating, dangerous. He looked up at her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome," he said, his voice low and smooth, like velvet wrapped around steel. "You've been quite the problem." Her throat went dry. He knew. He knew everything. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. What was this place? Why had they brought her here? His eyes never left hers as he stood up, walking around the desk slowly, deliberately. "You've seen too much." And now, he paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "Now, you're part of it." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She tried to back away, but the two men who had followed her into the room closed the distance, blocking her escape. She swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her neck. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound strong. "This," the Sheikh said, stepping closer, "is where it all comes together. This is where the truth lies. And you, my dear, are the final piece." Her mind was spinning, but one thing was clear. Whatever she thought she had uncovered, whatever she believed was the truth, it was only the beginning. The final piece? What was he talking about? Her heart raced as the realization hit her. Asterisk the murder. Lori Show. Everything asterisk, it was all connected, and she was now in the center of it. "You've been searching for answers," the Sheikh continued, his voice low and almost amused. "But you're too close now. Too much has been exposed. The network is delicate, and you, unfortunately, have threatened to undo everything." "Network?" she whispered, the word foreign on her lips. He smiled again, but this time there was nothing warm about it. "The network," he said, his tone dark, "is much larger than you could ever imagine. You've crossed the line, and now," he gestured toward the two men, "you're going to help me tie up loose ends." Before she could respond, the men grabbed her again, their grip firm, unyielding. One of them pulled a chair from the desk and pushed her into it. Her mind raced as the fear settled into her bones. She was trapped, in the center of a web, and the final piece? It was her heart thundered in her chest as they secured her to the chair. The cold metal of the restraints bit into her wrists, her body tense with panic. She tried to breathe, but each breath felt heavier than the last. The Sheikh paced in front of her, his eyes never leaving her face. His calmness, his control, it unsettled her more than anything. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into," he murmured, his voice like silk, each word measured, deliberate. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, but the words were stuck in her throat. Her mind raced, spinning with confusion. The network, the truth, it was all too much, and she was suffocating under the weight of it. The Sheikh stopped in front of her, his eyes cold and calculating. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his fingers icy against her skin. "You've learned too much," he repeated, his tone dark, final. "And now, you're part of something far bigger than you'll ever comprehend." A chill ran through her as she struggled against the restraints, her thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and disbelief. The Sheikh leaned in, his face inches from hers. "Lori Show wasn't the first. She won't be the last," he whispered. Her blood ran cold at the mention of Lori's name. "What do you mean?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely audible. He straightened up, his cold smile returning. "You'll understand soon enough." A sudden movement caught her eye. One of the men behind her shifted, his hand reaching into his coat pocket. Her stomach twisted in fear. Were they going to kill her? But the man didn't pull out a gun. Instead, he held out a small vial filled with a thick, dark liquid. Her breath caught. The Sheikh turned toward her, his expression almost amused. "A small measure," he said, his voice a whisper, "to ensure you're compliant." She realized then, with a shock that made her stomach lurch, what it was. The truth behind Laurie's death, the whispers of a hidden agenda. It all circled back to this moment. A slow, sick realization dawned on her. Her body felt like it was being drained of energy, each muscle weakening as the vial was brought closer to her lips. The liquid was some kind of poison. She knew that now. Her pulse quickened. "Please," she gasped, her voice trembling with desperation. "I don't know anything. I didn't mean to." The Sheikh's smile faded, his gaze hardening. "Don't play games with me," he said coldly. "You're already involved. Whether you accept it or not, you are part of this world now. And that means you have a choice to make." Her mind whirled. What was he saying? A choice? Was it a choice to die? A choice to be a part of this network? The vial hovered closer. The man behind her tilted it toward her mouth, the thick liquid moving slowly inside. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the terror building like a tidal wave threatening to swallow her whole. The Sheikh's gaze bore into her unblinking, as if he was waiting for her to make the final move. Her throat constricted, and she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. But then, a thought sliced through the chaos in her mind. Fight back. Her heart raced as her hand, still bound, jerked violently. In one swift motion, she threw herself sideways, slamming into the desk, knocking the vial from the man's hand. It shattered on the floor, the dark liquid spilling across the stone tiles. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, everything exploded into chaos. The two men lunged at her, but she was faster now. Fear had given her strength, and she wrenched herself free of the chair, her legs burning as she pushed herself to her feet. She barely registered the Sheikh's furious shout as she bolted toward the door, her body moving on pure adrenaline. She heard them behind her, the sound of footsteps gaining. She was running on instinct now, the raw terror propelling her forward, every sense alert to the dangers around her. The compound was huge, too big for her to understand in a single glance. She could hear voices echoing in the halls as she ran, men shouting, doors slamming open. But there was one thing she knew for sure. She couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. She threw herself into the next corridor, heart pounding in her ears. Every second, every breath, felt like it could be her last. She had no plan, no direction, just the urge to survive. The door at the end of the hall. She ran for it, her hands trembling as she reached for the handle. But as her fingers touched it, the door was yanked open from the other side. And there, standing in front of her, was the man who had been hunting her from the start. The man with the gun. And this time, she couldn't escape. Her body froze. The man with the gun stood before her, his cold eyes locking onto hers. He was taller now, more menacing in the dim light, and the gun in his hand gleamed ominously. The door behind her was locked. There was nowhere to go. Her heart thundered in her chest, and despite the fear, a surge of defiance rose within her. She wasn't done. Not yet. Her breathing was shallow, but she forced herself to stay calm, to think. The man said nothing. His gaze never wavered. He knew what she was thinking. "End of the road," he finally said, his voice flat, emotionless. His words were like a death sentence, but something in her snapped. She had come too far to give up now. Her hands were still bound, but she needed to move fast. In one desperate movement, she kicked the door, throwing her shoulder into it as hard as she could. The force sent the man stumbling back, and the gun shifted slightly in his grasp. It was enough. She lunged for it, her hands shaking, desperate to seize control. The gun was within reach. For a split second, everything felt as if it had slowed to a crawl. The tension, the space between them, the world itself. And then she grabbed it. She yanked the gun free from his hand, twisting it around to point at him. The man's eyes widened with shock, but there was no time to savor the moment. Her instincts took over as she backed away, keeping the gun trained on him. "I don't want to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling, though she hated herself for it. "But I will if I have to." The man didn't move, his expression unreadable. He wasn't scared, not in the slightest. "You think you can stop this?" he asked, his voice low, almost mocking. The words hit her like a slap in the face. No, she couldn't stop this. Not alone. But she could survive. And right now, that's all that mattered. With a sharp movement, she twisted the doorknob and threw the door open wide. Without a second glance, she sprinted into the hallway, her pulse roaring in her ears. She didn't look back. Her survival depended on one thing: getting out. And with every ounce of strength she had left, she would escape. Even if it cost her everything. Her breath was ragged as she ran, her heart hammering in her chest with each desperate step. The sound of her own footsteps echoed down the cold, dimly lit corridor. She could feel the walls closing in around her, but the open door ahead was her only hope. The man with the gun hadn't followed. Yet, every part of her body screamed for rest, but she couldn't stop. Not now. The compound stretched on, a labyrinth of hallways and doors, each one holding secrets she didn't fully understand. But as the seconds passed, she realized something. She had made it this far. She had uncovered enough to know that walking away now wasn't an option. She needed the truth, and whatever that truth was, it was locked away in this place. Her vision blurred with exhaustion, but she pushed forward, weaving through the maze. The compound had to have an exit, some way out of this nightmare. She refused to be trapped forever. Finally, she saw it, the exit. A heavy steel door with a keypad, glowing faintly in the dark. She didn't know the code, but she didn't care. She reached for the door, her fingers trembling, but before she could press the keypad, a voice froze her in place. "You're not getting out that easily." The Sheikh's voice. She turned to find him standing at the far end of the corridor, his figure half-shrouded in darkness. His calm expression was gone, replaced by something darker, more menacing. "I gave you a chance," he said, stepping forward, his voice smooth, almost sad. "But you chose the wrong path." She tightened her grip on the door handle, her heart in her throat. There was no escape, no way out. But then, something clicked inside her. The fight, the will to survive. It was stronger than the fear, stronger than the terror that had nearly consumed her. "I'll find a way," she said, her voice steady. "I will." The Sheikh said nothing more, his gaze piercing. And for one brief moment, they stood locked in a silent standoff, two fates intertwined, neither willing to back down. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She didn't need the answers. She just needed freedom. And as the door swung open and the cold air hit her face, she knew she would find it, one way or another. And the truth would remain buried, just a whisper in the dark.